This is a Lovecraftian horror novel from our very own story curator. We can put him on the map by simply pre-ordering the book at the link below. I'm going to put that in the comments section and pin it, so just click on that, go pre-order the book, and even leave a review. And if you do, don't forget to mention Booze and Booze. I would greatly appreciate it if you did that, and I know Zach would too. Before you listen to the episode or after the episode, just simply go over there, pre-order the book, and leave a review. Thank you so much, and let's get into today's episode, shall we? I've been known to spend my summer and fall weeks in the backcountry of Idaho and Montana, fishing, backpacking, and just generally roughing it outdoors. There was one season that I went out and had this experience that really creeped me out. So much so that I didn't even really tell anybody about it. I made a police report, but that was it. This was one of those same summers. I was in the middle of nowhere, Montana. There was a lake, and I'd heard some rumors about what I planned on investigating. The descent into that remote valley was no joke whatsoever. 9 miles, most of them at this steep grade that turned my legs to jelly before I could even reach the halfway point. If you would slip, the jagged shale would cut you to ribbons. Every single step I took was calculated, deliberate. There was absolutely no room for carelessness out here. When I reached the bottom and saw that crystal clear lake nestled between two cliffs, all that strain faded into the background. The water was like glass, shimmering in the sun, untouched and completely pristine. It felt like I stumbled into a hidden world where civilization was just a distant memory. Exactly what I've been hoping for. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The towering pines, the scent of pine needles and fresh water. The utter silence broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird. No one else was around. It was just me in the wild. I'd heard rumors about this spot. A few backcountry anglers swore it had landlocked salmon, some as big as your arm. I wasn't sure if I believed them, but I was here to find out. Of course, everybody hears about these landlocked salmon, but they aren't always easy to locate. This was something of a bucket list trip for me. Once I'd shaken off that fatigue from the hike, I set my pack down and strung my rod up, eager to hit the water before I even thought about setting up camp. The fish did not disappoint. Cast after cast, I was pulling in beauties, 2-3 pounds each. Every single one fought like hell. By the time the sun hit its peak in the sky, I had half a dozen good-sized salmon on a stringer. Dinner was guaranteed that night, and I still had hours of daylight left. It turned out those old-timers were right. There was salmon in this lake, and I'd be eating good for supper. I staked my fish down in the shallows, then found a spot in the shade of a boulder to just relax for a bit. The afternoon was just perfect. A cool, gentle breeze was coming off the lake. The sun was warming the rocks. And the kind of quiet that's so complete, it really feels like you're the last person on Earth. I kicked back and ate some lunch and just let my mind wander, thinking about really nothing in particular. That's when I took notice of them. 2 figures way off in the distance moving between the trees. I couldn't really make out much, just that they were there. I figured and assumed they were just hikers or campers or maybe even hunters like myself. Out here you mind your business and others just mind theirs. I let it go, closed my eyes, and drifted off into this unplanned nap. When I woke up, the sun was dipping behind the ridge, casting a long shadow over the valley. I cursed myself for wasting so much daylight. I still needed to get camp set up before it got too dark. I hurried through my routine, pitched my tent, laid out a cook site, rigged the pulley system to hang my food and trash out of reach of any bears. That whole time I kept feeling like I was being watched. I don't know why. Probably just residual nerves from spotting those hikers earlier, but it was enough to keep me glancing over my shoulder a few times. By the time I had everything in order, the light was almost gone. The air was cooling fast. I grabbed my fish and cleaned them up and got them ready for the fire. Real simple stuff, just butter, garlic, and a pinch of dried chives. When they were wrapped in foil and nestled in the coals, the scent was mouth-watering. As I sat there enjoying one of the best meals I'd ever cooked, I noticed a faint glow way down the shore, another fire. And beyond it, I could just make out the flicker of shadows moving as well. It had to be those people that I saw earlier. Figured they were settling in for the night, same as me. But that's when the shouting started. At first, it was muffled by distance, the sound of voices rising in some kind of argument. I couldn't make out any of the words, just the tone. Agitated, angry. I thought maybe it was some kind of drunken disagreement, some campers just getting rowdy. Then it escalated, fast. The shouts turned into something primal, desperate even. And then came the scream. A high-pitched wail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand right up. It echoed off the cliffs, bouncing through the valley, lingering in the air long after it should have faded. It was one of those kinds of screams that you never forget, the kind that drills its way into your bones. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to process what I was hearing. I sat there, frozen, staring off into the darkness where that fire flickered in the distance. Part of me was telling myself it really isn't my problem. Whatever was happening out there had nothing to do with me. But I couldn't just sit here, pretending I didn't hear it. I stood up, straining to see through the shadows. That screaming had stopped abruptly, leaving behind an awful, ringing silence. My gut then twisted as I heard something else. Footsteps, running, crunching over the gravel and deadfall, getting closer. Whoever it was, I could hear them crashing through the loose shale over and over again. They'd be cut to ribbons by the time they got here. The next thing I knew, somebody burst out of the trees and stumbled in the glow of my fire. A woman. She was wild-eyed, bruised, and her clothes were torn and hanging off of her like rags. She looked like she'd been through hell. "Help me," she gasped. Her voice was raw from screaming. "Please, they're coming." Blood ran out of all manner of wounds. Cuts along her head, gashes in her arms and legs. I really could not believe what I was seeing. She asked me for help again and then collapsed to the ground, on the verge of tears. I acted on instinct. "Get in the tent," I hissed, grabbing her by the arm and shoving her inside. "Stay quiet." She crawled inside without hesitation, curled up into the corner, trembling like a leaf. I zipped the tent closed and then took a seat by the fire, trying to look as casual as possible, even though my heart was thudding inside my chest. This was very out of character for me, but I guess so was this entire situation. All I knew was this lady came running to me, and now she was asking for help. This was really the only plan that came to mind in the moment. A few minutes later, I heard them. 2 men. They appeared just beyond the light, shadows with hard edges and rough voices. They stopped when they saw me. Their eyes narrowed as they took in the scene. I could tell right away these guys were trouble. "Hey there," one of them said, his voice oily and all too friendly. "You seen a girl come by here?" Shook my head. "Nope, I heard some screaming though. I figured it was just coyotes or something." They exchanged a look and then one of them stepped closer. His gaze locked onto me. He had that kind of face that looked like it was carved from a rock, rough, weathered, with a mean glint in his eyes. You sure about that, partner? We lost somebody. She might be in trouble." I met his stare, forcing myself to shrug. "Like I said, I haven't seen anybody. I'm just out here fishing, trying to enjoy some peace and quiet." I could tell the men weren't buying it. They continued to linger, their eyes sweeping over my camp, searching for something out of place. I stayed put, kept my expression neutral, and slowly took another bite of my fish, pretending like this was just another night in the woods. Eventually, the one in charge, or at least seemed to be, grunted and jerked his head towards the darkness. "All right then, keep your eyes open. You see her? Give us a shout." "Sure thing," I replied. I was just beyond grateful for my voice not giving away the adrenaline bursting just underneath my skin. It wouldn't have taken much for these guys to see right through me. Another factor then occurred to me. If that girl in the tent moved or made any kind of noise, she was screwed. Maybe even myself too. I prayed that she stayed silent. They turned to leave, but I could feel them watching even as they moved away, their fingers blending into the shadows at the edge of the trees. For a long time after they disappeared, I just sat there staring into the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames, straining to hear any sign of them doubling back. The woman didn't make a sound from inside the tent. Thank God, because I could see those two goons hiding out in the tree line for the next 15 or 20 minutes, watching my every single move. They were convinced I had the girl, so had kept an eye on me from a distance. After what felt like an eternity, the forest settled back into its uneasy quiet. I looked down casually and found the men were gone. My thoughts were racing as I unzipped the tent and peered inside. The woman's eyes met mine, wide with terror, pleading for answers that I didn't have. Her breath was ragged and her knuckles were white from clutching her knees to her chest. "Hey, they're gone for now," I whispered. "But we need to talk. What the hell is going on?" She hesitated, tears welling up. I could tell she was wrestling with whether she could trust me or not. But whatever she's been through, it must have been worse than her taking her chances with a stranger. It's all messed up," she stammered. "I was with friends, or I thought they were friends. We were just camping like you, but things went bad. Real bad." "Okay, bad how?" I asked, glancing nervously towards the tree line where those men had vanished from. "It was supposed to be this fun weekend," she said, shaking her head like she was trying to wake up from some kind of nightmare. "But they started arguing, about me mostly. Jealousy, possessiveness, like I was somebody's girlfriend. They got drunk and then everything spiraled. One of them, Todd, he's the worst. He's obsessed. He said if he couldn't have me, no one could. When I tried to leave, he snapped and started getting really rough with me. And that's when I ran." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I was suddenly aware of just how isolated we were out here. No cell service, no quick escape. We're miles from the nearest road, deep inside the belly of this valley, with nothing but our wits and whatever gear I had in my pack. "Look," I said, we can't stay here. They'll definitely come back. We need to get the hell out of this valley. It's a 9-mile hike back to the trailhead, but if we move now, we might..." Before I could finish, a low rustling sound came from the dark. We both froze, listening, straining both of our ears. It was not the wind, and it wasn't just an animal. Those footsteps were back, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. My stomach tightened into a knot. The men had not gone far. They were circling back, closing in like a pack of wolves. "Stay in the tent," I whispered urgently. "Don't move, don't make any noise." I stepped back into the cool night air, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. My fire had died down to glowing embers, casting this faint red light that barely even pushed across the encroaching dark. Those footsteps grew louder, and then I saw them. Those two men emerging from the gloom, creeping like predators who had all night to play this stupid game. We thought we'd check back with you," the taller one drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "We got the feeling you weren't being straight with us, so I'll ask you again. You sure you haven't seen her?" "Like I told you before, man," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm out here alone. You're barking up the wrong tree, I'm telling you." The shorter man grinned, showing teeth stained from years of neglect. "We think you're hiding something, mister, and you might want to reconsider being a hero out here." My heart pounded as they advanced toward me. These guys were done playing nice. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't leaving without her. And if they found her, God knows what they'd do to both of us. I had to stall, buy some time, but there's only so much bluffing that I could do. Just as I was about to say something, they both lunged. The bigger one barreled into me, knocking me back into the rocky ground. Pain shut up my spine, but I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline numbing everything but the instinct to fight. They were tearing at the tent now, yanking the zipper open. The woman's screams split the night sky again as they dragged her out, kicking and thrashing. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, but it was no use. A shorter man clamped a filthy hand down over her mouth while the taller one hoisted her by the arms, dragged her across the dirt like a sack of grain. The look on his face was terrifyingly casual, like this was just another chore to get done before bedtime. "You got it all wrong," the tall man said, as if he were trying to soothe the child. "We're just taking her back to camp, where she belongs. Ain't nothing to worry about." "Let her go!" I shouted. I knew it was useless. They didn't even glance my way. "I'll call the police." I wanted to do something, anything, but they were just too strong, too determined. And I was one man against two who looked like they'd been brawling in bars since they could throw a punch. Top of that, these guys truly did not give a shit. The woman's fight started to fade in her, struggling weakening as the realization hit that she could not win against them. Soon, she was just letting them drag her, a beaten, hollow look in her eyes. She glanced back at me, and that one look carried all the desperation and resignation in the world. It would haunt me for a lifetime. As they hauled her off into the dark, I stayed frozen, fists clenched and useless at my sides. The night swallowed them up, the crackle of their fire growing fainter until it was just a distant ghostly flicker on the far side of the lake. The scream stopped, replaced by the eerie quiet of the wilderness. No more shouting, no more footsteps. Just the hiss of the wind through the trees and the distant lap of water against the shore. I stood there shaking and listening, waiting for some clue that it wasn't over. But it was. They were gone, back into whatever twisted hole they crawled out of. I should have done something, anything more than just stand there. But what could I really do against two men like that? Tried convincing myself it was better to stay alive and report it later, but the guilt gnawed at me. I even had a gun, but that actually put it into perspective for me. Was I gonna shoot and kill two strangers over a situation that I didn't fully understand? Throw my life away for potentially nothing? I went back to my fire, feeding the dying coals until the flames licked up again, trying to anchor myself into something familiar, something halfway normal. But nothing felt right anymore. I was just sitting there staring into the flames, wondering what the hell just happened and what would happen to that woman. Would they let her go, or was she already gone in a way that I didn't want to think about? I couldn't sleep that night. Every snap of a twig made me jerk awake, half expecting those men to come back, grinning and blood-stained. Dawn eventually broke, and with it came the harsh, lonely reality of the day. I made coffee, packed up my gear, and tried to shake off that sick feeling clinging to me like a second skin. Part of me wanted to hike over to that campsite, confront whatever was left, but I didn't have the nerve. Instead, I spent the morning fishing, like any other day. The salmon bit as eagerly as before, but now it felt hollow. No joy, no satisfaction. Just a mechanical act of casting and reeling. By noon, I could no longer stay. I packed up, shouldered my gear, and started that grueling hike out of the valley. Each step bringing me closer to civilization, and further from whatever nightmare that I left behind. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, there was a moment of hesitation. Should I tell somebody, the sheriff, a ranger? And if I did, what good would it do? The remoteness, the lack of details, and uncertainty of what I'd really seen. It felt too thin, too vague to make a difference. But I just couldn't also leave it hanging over my head either. I reported what I saw, gave them everything that I could remember. But I figured it wouldn't lead anywhere. It was a needle in a haystack. I was just one guy with a very strange story to tell. Days went by, then weeks. And I never heard anything more. No news, no follow-ups, nothing. Sometimes now late at night when I'm lying awake, I think about that woman and wonder if she made it out of the valley alive, or if she's still down there, screaming in the dark, now bones among the trees. I wonder if deep down I could have done something more. There was something I missed, something that could have saved her. But I'll never know. All I have is the memory, gnawing at me like a dull ache. The echo of that scream still bouncing off the walls of the canyon, long after the shadows had swallowed them up. This was in 2017. I was turning 18 at the time, and I'm 25 now. I'm also a man, just to give the audience some perspective. I haven't told anybody in my personal life because of two reasons. One, they'll think I'm A, crazy, or more likely B, making it all up. But I've got a reputation for being honest. Tall tales just aren't my thing. Also, for what it's worth to any of you, I'm not religious. I'd say I'm agnostic. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I don't think it's impossible, as I don't really know everything, far from it. The story doesn't really help, but I don't believe in ghost stories for the most part. UFOs, that kind of thing. Very skeptical of all that stuff, and believe there are more rational explanations that are far less exciting for people than they'd like to believe. But this is something that I experience that I cannot explain. And again, I'm a pretty straight shooter. So, for a little backstory, my mother and little sister were on their way to visit my grandparents, who lived in this tiny little town called Eminence, Missouri. It's about 30 minutes south of my town, deep in the mountains. It's not super remote, but there are neighbors a few miles away and such. They were the hillbilly types, as you can imagine. It's deep in the Ozarks in Missouri, so yeah, lots of missing teeth and meth, and crazy old mountain folk. If you've been in the Missouri hills, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we were staying in a camper about 200 feet or so from my grandparents' house itself. My mom, my sister, and I. One day, a few hours before dark, I decided to get on the four-wheeler and go into the woods. I toyed around in the woods and hills a little bit, but I really wanted to get deep in there on that four-wheeler and just have some fun. This was one of the few things to do that I enjoy doing while on these visits, as our grandparents' house is in the middle of nowhere. There's not really that much to do. I filled the four-wheeler up and asked my grandparents where the trail was. I drove off, rode for about 40 minutes in one direction until I was nearly out of gas. And about this time, I was searching for a place just to turn around and head back up. It was a small and narrow trail, so I had to wait until there was a small clearing to do some kind of U-turn. This is where things got weird. I remember as I was riding, the trees blowing in the wind, the bird songs, the animal noises, the woodpeckers, all of those wonderful sounds of nature that I love so much from these woods. Suddenly, out of nowhere, they all stopped. It went dead silent, and I mean dead silent. I remember goosebumps going up all over my body just from the lack of noise alone. Knowing there were animals around, but everything was silent. It felt like I was in some kind of noise vacuum or something. Everything felt different, sounded different, or more accurately, sounded like nothing at all. The only noise was the four-wheeler, and even that sound seemed muffled and far away. Definitely the strangest sensation I've ever felt. As I was riding down the mountain, I saw this huge deer, or antlered deer-like animal. And I mean, it was fucking massive, standing in the pathway that I was driving on. I'd say 50 feet in front of me. For some reason, it was impossible to tell for sure how far away it was, as my depth perception was totally scrambled. It was almost like it was flickering in and out of being there. It was not moving, just staring at me, and it had these dark, dark black eyes, like I was staring into a complete void. Immense darkness that stood out from every color of the forest very clearly. I can still see this animal in my dreams, staring directly at me. I still will have nightmares every now and again about this thing. The antlers were nearly the size of its body. They also looked like tree roots or something. I'm not really too familiar with deer. I've never hunted or anything, but those antlers just didn't look like anything I'd ever seen on a deer or on any animal that has antlers itself. Too large, too spindly. It was off, terribly off, and I could feel my heart jump into my throat. I stopped the four-wheeler almost instantly and just stared back at it. I was terrified, but I also couldn't help but just stare back. I then remember the wind started blowing and rustling of the trees. It almost sounded like the trees were speaking to me. Or again, maybe I was just hearing things and scared out of my mind. I just got this overwhelming sensation and this feeling that I was being told to leave and never return. That's really all I could make out. But again, I never heard those words spoken. It was just a feeling. I don't know how else to explain it. So that's exactly what I did. I left. I turned the four-wheeler around and nearly toppled over on the trail, falling down some 15-foot drop near the edge. Since I hadn't really found a good U-turn clearing yet, I wasn't about to keep driving towards that deer or whatever it was. It's a very tight U-turn, but I made it and floored that four-wheeler as fast as it could go. It was still dead silent, and I've never heard silence like that. My father is a sound engineer. He has a home studio, and that studio has these dead boxes you can sing in and has no noise from the soundproofing. That's the closest I can really explain to you about that deafening silence. I experienced that out there. It was that quiet. Remember, this is the Ozarks. Animals are squawking all over, and I could not hear a thing. I floored that four-wheeler as fast as it could go, back up the mountains, around the bends, and never looked back. There was a few times I almost upended the whole machine over one cliffside or another. I almost killed myself for real. I was only racing this fast because occasionally when I looked back, that animal was still trotting along with me. It almost looked more normal now, like an actual deer, but it was still massive beyond any recognition. I got onto a flat, straight stretch of the path and figured I was about halfway back to the trail entrance. That's when I started seeing all kinds of animals, deer, birds, even a black bear, the only one I've ever seen in my entire life, just standing or sitting just off the trail, maybe 15-20 feet back in the woods. And they were all staring at me, all of them. No sound, no movements, just their heads tracking me as I walked. Eyes locked on me. Even the birds up in the branches seemed to do the same. It was still dead silent, not even a breeze. It's that awful, frozen silence as I hurried past them all, their eyes burning into my back long after I was out of sight. Still to this day, the scariest, most unsettling feeling I've ever experienced in my entire life. I pushed on as fast as I could. The sun was sinking lower, but there's still enough light. Maybe an hour left before it set completely. Just kept moving. But then as I started passing spots that I didn't recognize at all, it felt like I was almost on a different trail, or maybe had taken a wrong turn. But that didn't make any sense. This trail has no turnoffs, it's just a straight single-track path, one way in and one way out. But everything around me looked completely different from what I'd seen on the way in. Panic crept in, but I forced myself to keep going, repeating that it wasn't possible. I had not gone the wrong way. I also remember passing this massive tree covered in moss, like something straight out of a fantasy movie. It was that kind of thing that you would definitely notice on the way in, but here it was now, standing out like it just appeared. The terrain and trees around it, all draped in this thick moss, felt entirely unfamiliar. I also noticed that my four-wheeler tracks, which should have definitely been there, were now somehow gone, like they'd been wiped away. That fear that I was on the wrong trail crept back in. But again, I reminded myself that was not possible. It's a one-way path. Still, I wasn't about to turn back and check for a turnoff that I knew did not exist. Eventually, the trail reappeared again. Everything started to look normal once more, and I could see my tracks reappear like nothing had ever happened. Somehow, I passed through this stretch where everything was different, like the landscape had shifted, erased my tracks. I can't explain it to myself, and honestly, I hate thinking about it still. So I know how it sounds to you. Shortly after getting back on what I'll call the normal trail, I remember the wind picking back up again. But this time it started to speak in that strange foreign language that I mentioned earlier. I've spent plenty of time in the woods when it's windy, but I've never felt or heard anything like this before. It was otherworldly. Even now, thinking about it, it terrifies me. This time though, it sounded a lot less ominous and more friendly. Like it was encouraging me to keep going, as if leaving was the right decision, as if whatever was out there was no longer angry at me for intruding. I finally reached the entrance to the trail, where it branched into a Y. I had taken the right path earlier, and the left path was another way to another trail leading off in a different direction. Bottom of the Y led back to the highway. As I pulled off onto the shoulder, that dead silence fell over everything again. I glanced back, saw the exact same deer, or again, whatever it was, standing there. This time it was moving though, stomping its foot and tossing its head like a horse shaking off flies. The wind blew one last time, and though no words were formed, I felt or had that feeling again, like it was saying, "Never return," or something close to it. The deer then walked into the trees and disappeared from sight. A few seconds later, the birds started singing again. The usual sounds of the forest returned. Everything snapped back to normal, expected rhythm of the woods. Just sat there staring back at the trail, relieved to be out, but also completely baffled by what I just experienced. Shaking so badly that I could barely even keep my thumb on the throttle as I sped onto the highway, desperate to get back home. I raced down the road, covering the mile or two back to my grandparents' driveway. On the way, I passed a local guy on a gator, one of those farm-style ATVs with a cargo bed in the back. He waved at me, and maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but there was something in his expression, like he knew exactly what I'd seen, like he was in on it somehow. I waved back to him, trying to shake off the unease, and just kept going. All I know is I'm never going to set foot inside the Ozarks again, or any mountains for that matter. People think I'm lying, making up stories, or that I lost my mind for a little bit. But I know what I saw. I have no idea what it meant, but whatever that was, did not want me there. Maybe it was a hallucination, which honestly would make more sense than the alternative. Just another one of those weird wood stories that you hear about, right? The thing is, as crazy as all of this sounds, I never actually felt like I was in danger. Those animals didn't seem intent on harming me, just driving me out. It felt like they were guiding me back, almost like they were doing me a favor. Even with the deer's pitch black eyes, they didn't seem menacing, just empty. Even in the nightmares that I occasionally still will have about that creature, it's never hostile. If anything, it feels protective. But that doesn't make it any less terrifying. Like it's some kind of twisted guardian angel, shepherding me away from places that I don't belong. I've had dreams totally unrelated to the woods, and yet that deer will suddenly appear, leading me out. It's bizarre. I have no idea what to make about any of it. Believe me or not, that's my story. There's something about being old friends that just lets you pick right up where you left off, even after years spent apart. That's how it was with Emma. We hadn't seen one another since college. A few texts and social media likes here and there, but life gets busy. Still, when she suggested a weekend trip to the Ozarks, It felt like no time had passed at all. Just the two of us, like old times, hiking, swimming, paddleboarding, and talking about life in general. This was going to be a massive throwback. Emma and I had met in college, as we both shared the same major and had many of the same classes. It also turned out that we both liked the same music, both liked to party, and even ended up sharing a dorm at one point. We did everything together back then, including our weekend excursions to the river. We went to school near the Ozarks, so this was a pretty typical trip for us. The drive to the river itself was peaceful, the early morning sun breaking through the mist that clung to the hills. Forest was lush, everything green and vibrant, almost too alive. We found a perfect spot with a wide stretch of the river and smooth water, plenty of space to spread out. Emma was already popping open a Mike's Hard Lemonade when I unloaded the paddle boards from my car. We laughed as if no time had passed. Old jokes, old stories, that kind of banter that just flows naturally when you've known somebody for this long. The morning slipped by like a dream. We swam in the cool water and lounged on the riverbank, sunbathed on our boards while floating lazily down the river. Everything felt right, familiar, warm, comfortable. There was a group of birds drifting around above us, making these lazy arcs in the sunshine. It reminded me of bad omens for some reason, and I didn't mention anything to Emma, but it felt like a weird thing to talk about after so much time spent apart. After a quick lunch, we decided to head downstream and explore. The current was gentle, just enough to guide us along without much effort. The river wound deeper into the woods, the banks narrowing as trees leaned in closer and closer, their branches now forming a canopy overhead. It was almost magical, especially with the sun casting dappled patterns on the water. I'd say a half a mile down, we found this small alcove tucked away behind a bend, the water shallow enough to beach our boards. This shore was more rugged here, overgrown with brambles and vines that tugged at our clothes as we made our way onto the dry land. "Hey, let's hike up that trail," Emma said, pointing to a narrow path that snaked into the forest. "It's gotta lead somewhere cool." "Yeah, if we don't want to get lost and eaten by bugs first," I joked. But I was up for adventure. We both were, clearly, as Emma had now cracked open another drink and led us blindly into the wilderness. The trail was beautiful, no doubt, but the deeper we went, the thicker and darker the woods almost became. The trees began to glow closer together, blotting out the sky. The air felt different, heavier, like it was now pressing in on us. The birdsong and rustling of leaves now faded away, leaving the only sound of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. "You notice how quiet it is now?" Emma asked after a bit, her voice softer, almost as if she didn't want to disturb whatever else was out there. "Yeah," I replied. "Maybe it's just that time of day, or maybe we're scaring everything off." "Maybe," she muttered, but she didn't seem too convinced. We trekked deeper, pushing past thorny bushes that scratched against our legs, trying not to trip on gnarled roots that snaked across the trail. After about 2 miles, we found a fork in the trail that split off into 2 narrow paths, both leading down to a rocky riverbed. The spot was gorgeous, crystal clear water cascading over these smooth stones, with mossy banks that looked straight out of some kind of nature documentary. "Oh, this is perfect," Emma said, setting her pack down, taking her phone out for some pictures. "I'm gonna pee real quick. I'll be right back." "Don't get lost," I called after her as she wandered off into the trees. I sat down by the water, letting the sound of that stream lull me into this peaceful daze. This is what I came for, soaking up the sun, just chilling out with a friend, seeing things the average tourist would never find. That peace was immediately shattered, and Emma's scream tore through the woods. I jumped up, my heart slamming into my chest. "Emma?" I shouted. But there was no response, just more screaming, frantic and high-pitched. I ran, crashing through the underbrush toward where she'd gone, branches whipping in my face. When I found her, she was scrambling to pull her pants up, her eyes wide with terror. "What's wrong? What happened?" "Somebody's watching us," she cried out, pointing to the dense tangle of trees beyond me. My heart skipped a beat as I processed her words. I turned, scanning the dark woods with my pulse racing. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows and twisted trunks. But then out of the corner of my eye, I caught some movement, a shape in the trees. A man. No, not just a man, but something was wrong with him. His body was twisting in this way that didn't seem natural, like he was crouching or hunched down, but still impossibly tall. His face was smeared with dirt and mud, and his skin had this strange, uneven texture, as if it had melted or warped in places. And then he did the most unnerving thing ever. He waved at us. Just a slow, deliberate wave, his fingers curling in a way that made my skin crawl. "All right, let's go," I shouted, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her away. We took off running down the trail, not caring about any more scratches or the branches tearing at us along the way. You'd hear noises all around, whoops and hollers, almost like a mocking laughter echoing through the trees. We sprinted down a steep embankment, and that's when Emma stumbled. She twisted her ankle and went down hard, gasping in pain. I skidded to a stop and dropped to my knees beside her. "Hey, are you okay? Can you walk?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I think I sprained it." I looked around as my mind raced. We had to get the hell out of here, but we were still at least a mile from the river. I started wrapping her ankle with some bandage wrap that I had in my pack, trying to do it quickly but gently. This was the last thing that we needed now, considering how much ground we still had to cover just to get back to the cars. This would be a problem on its own, coupled with that creep in the trees. I don't know how bad it's about to get. That's when she stopped crying and made this weird choking noise. "What is it?" I asked, still trying to focus on her ankle. She didn't answer me, just stared, eyes locked on something just over my shoulder. I turned and there he was again, standing at the top of the slope, no more than 20 feet away. He had this toothy smile that sent a shiver straight down my spine. He started laughing then, a high-pitched, cackling laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. And then again, just like before, he waved at us, then sprinted off into the trees with a shriek that echoed through the woods. Emma was sobbing now, and I wasn't far from it. "We gotta move, now," I said, yanking her up as gently as I could. She leaned on me, limping as we made our way back to the trail. Those noises following behind, branches snapping, leaves rustling, more of those mocking whoops. It almost felt like the woods themselves were alive and just playing with us, taunting. I tried to stay focused and put one leg in front of the other. The closer we got to the river, the worse it got. I could feel hands brushing against my hair, tugging at my shirt. Once, I heard a giggle right in my ear, but when I whipped around, there was nothing there, just the thick, dark trees closing in around us. It felt like we were being herded, driven towards something, but I didn't want to think about what that something might be. In the last 40 or 50 feet, whoever it was kept yanking my hair so hard that it tore some out. We finally broke through the tree line, stumbled onto the riverbank, gasping for breath. Our paddleboards were still there, thank God. We quickly strapped the gear down and shoved off into the water, then started paddling upstream as fast as we could. I could barely focus, my eyes darting back and forth to the shore every few seconds. We were both exhausted at this point, and Emma with her trail wounds. Progress was very minimal. We kept our eyes peeled as we moved along. And there he was again, dancing along the riverbank, just out of reach. He was making these jerky movements in these erratic ways, like a marionette with tangled strings. Sometimes he would disappear into the trees, then only to reappear further up. always keeping pace with us. "Faster," I urged Emma, even though I could tell she was completely exhausted and in pain. The current was stronger now. Every paddle stroke felt like a struggle. We paddled until our arms burned, but he continued to keep pace. I started to get sick with anxiety, realizing that if he followed us much further, we'd be out of options. We were almost completely out of energy. We were almost out of energy, almost to the departure point where we left our cars. Finally, after what felt like hours, we lost sight of him. The woods grew quieter and the trail that we'd hiked from our cars from came back into view. We didn't waste any time. We beached the boards, grabbed our things, and ran back up that trail toward the parking lot. We didn't stop until we were both inside the car, panting and shaking with adrenaline. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Then Emma let out this shaky laugh. It was a mix of disbelief and sheer relief. "The hell just happened?" she asked, still breathing hard. "I don't know," I said, trying to calm down my own racing heart. "But I do know we're never coming back here." We just sat there in stunned silence, trying to process it all. Eventually, we cracked open a snack and drank some more of those mics, trying to laugh it all off. But underneath, there was a shared understanding between us. What we just witnessed was not normal, and neither of us would forget it anytime soon. Weeks later, I heard a story from somebody else who'd been hiking in that same area. They described a man, tall with a twisted face, an eerie laugh, watching them from the trees. I didn't say anything to them, just listened and nodded. I didn't need to confirm it for them. I knew we weren't the only ones who encountered whatever that was lurking in those hills. The weirdest part to me is just how he simply disappeared. He followed us all that time, invested like a full mile and a half in the pursuit just to turn around. When we got to that spot that would lead us back to the car, there were some other folks in the area, a fisherman, a couple of other hikers. By then we were in company. We'd made contact with them. The guy chasing us had vanished at that point. It was almost as if there's a barrier or even a property line that weirdo wasn't allowed to cross. Whatever the case, we're definitely thankful to be free of him. Sometimes at night when I close my eyes to sleep, I think back to that wave, that mocking, cheerful gesture from the shadows. Almost like a taunt, a reminder that some places, no matter how beautiful they are, hold secrets that you're better off leaving alone. For obvious reasons, I haven't gone back to the Ozarks since this.